Thanks to all of you for coming out. I lived in Brisbane for like 7 years, and there are a bunch of familiar faces, and it's wonderful to see you. I appreciate your coming, and it's great to see some new faces as well. It's going to be a little bit of a polemic tonight. I have a kind of an agenda in the sense of this organization is very exciting to me because I think that a combination of academia, where I work, and public service journalism, and folks with, especially with interests in, who have technical expertise and technical backgrounds, it's a time for those groups to come together to participate in the what we're going to need increasingly urgently, I think, which is systems and institutions that hold algorithmic decision-making processes accountable. And so I'm going to give you some concrete examples of what I'm talking about when I'm thinking about algorithmic accountability. And then I'm going to bring up some of the principles that people have discussed when they think, all right, what do we mean by algorithmic accountability? What are the things that we're going to be looking at? And the principles, I think, are very much still in development, and they have a bunch of issues and problems. And so what I'm really interested in doing is getting to that, once we've looked at some concrete examples, taking a look at the principles and thinking, what are the issues here, and what types of principles do we need to come up with? And then who's going to implement those principles? Where will that take place? And so, to me, those are the kind of big questions. This is the overview of the set of claims I'm going to make. That increasingly we're living in a world that's shaped by algorithmic systems of all kinds. In particular, they're shaping our information environment. And in a variety of ways, and I'll give some examples, they're shaping our life chances. And the issue that's raised by the fact that they're doing this is that often the way these decisions are being made are opaque and unaccountable. They get baked into systems that don't allow for ways of seeing what's happening and evaluating what's happening in familiar past patterns of being able to do that. So we need to come up with new ways of doing that. And we need to figure out where that's going to take place, who's going to do it, why they would do it, and how they would do it. And so for me, this is the place that we're headed. And my worry is that if we don't head there, we end up ceding power to those folks who own, operate, control, and develop these algorithmic systems. And that has implications not only for individuals, but for how democratic society functions. So it's a big picture issue. A lot of the examples and a lot of the principles, when we come to them, focus on individual harms, which makes sense because it's on individuals where the kind of rubber hits the road. But the larger question is what this means, I think, for democratic society. So sorry, my PowerPoint skills are pretty crude. But I'm going to start with this video example. And, did I not?
That's all right. I should have asked you whether you needed
any volume. I wonder if I've got I wonder when we moved it. Is this the one on the desktop?
Possibly, yeah,
sorry, I think I'll...
You can open it up off the...
We can just open the video that's in there.
Oh?
Yeah.
This is using the video tracking software.
Sorry. This is just a small example to get us in. Some of you may know this and may have seen it. I'm going to try to blow it out a little bit. But it's about a particular facial recognition system that discriminates based on race. And it's a little entertaining example if you haven't seen it. But I'm going to talk about why this, this has implications beyond the kind of funny example that they have.
My coworker Wanda and I are sitting in front of an HP Media Smart computer.
State-of-the-art computer, wouldn't you say?
I'd say.
We're using the face tracking software, so it's supposed to follow me as I move. I'm black. I think my blackness is interfering with the computer's ability to follow me. As you can see, I do this, no following. Not really following me. I back up, I get really, really close to try to let the camera recognize me, not happening. Now, my white coworker, Wanda, is about to slide into frame. You will immediately see what I'm talking about. Wanda, if you would, please.
Sure.
Now, as you can see, the camera is panning to show Wanda's face. It's following her around. But as soon as my blackness enters the frame, which I will sneak into the frame. I'm sneaking in, I'm in there.
That's it.
And there we go, it stopped. My hands are here. Wanda, please get back in the frame. Get back in. As soon as white Wanda appears, the camera moves. Black Desi gets in there. Oh, nope. No face recognition anymore, buddy. I'm going on record, and I'm saying it. Hewlett-Packard computers are racist. I said it. And the worst part is, I bought one for Christmas. I hope my wife doesn't see this YouTube video, but I bought the same computer, and we can't even use. Look, it's not following me. It's not. Wanda, get back in the frame.
It follows me wherever I go.
All right, we got it. This has to do with what was used for training the algorithms in that machine. And certainly there are ways of addressing and fixing that problem once it's identified. But it's interesting that that particular example actually speaks to a larger issue around facial recognition technology that some of you may be familiar with, which is that many of them, because of the way they're trained, tend to be more accurate identifying white faces than African-American ones. And there's been some work done on this in US facial recognition systems that are being used, some of them by police departments to identify individuals. And what they found out is that the facial recognition algorithms systems that they're using to identify potential suspects, put them in public spaces or in areas of concern, are twice as likely to misidentify an African-American face than a white face. What that means is false negatives, but it also means false positives, which means you're twice as likely to be mistaken for somebody in their criminal database if you're African-American than if you're white. So there's a racial bias built into these policing systems. These policing systems have a variety of implications. One of them, of course, is identifying suspects. Another one is a system, sorry, that's gone off the top of the screen a little bit. It says the new way police are surveilling you, calculating your threat score. So they've developed these database-driven systems that calculate in real time when an event takes place in interaction with the police, the level of threat that the police should alert themselves about that's associated with whoever they're interacting with. In other words, how dangerous you are, and therefore what level of force might be need to brought to bear, right? So if you are falsely identified as somebody who's in their dangerous category, you're much more likely to get a more violent form of response, right? Or the police are going to be in that high alert mode. And so what I'm trying to get to here is this kind of seemingly innocuous example of facial recognition algorithms in one context can have quite dramatic consequences in other contexts, and remains a problem that's related to the systems that they use to develop and train the algorithms. It's the way that bias gets baked into the system. Another way, of course, is the pretty well-known Chicago heat list database that Chicago was using. They were taking they didn't disclose what data that they were using, but it turned out that it seems that what they were using was mostly social media information that they could scrape, and they were identifying potential future suspects in kind of Minority Report style, and the way they would intervene was they would actually show up at people's houses and tell them, we're watching you because the database says that you are likely to be involved in a crime, and we want you to know that we've got our eye on you. And so again, the question, what they found out was that a majority of the people that they were visiting were African American, and this had to do with presumably with the links that were established between people who were future suspects with people who had been had criminal records in the past. And so it was tied, of course, to existing patterns of policing in terms of who it was that turned up in their database. And that predicted the people who were connected to those people then ended up in the database here. And there's been, this is intriguing. I was kind of waiting to hear something like this happen. But this is not the heat list. This is a different database. This is a gang database. But somebody who claims that he was wrongly identified by an algorithm as being a gang member is suing on the basis of this false identification. And he's suing on the basis of the fact that he was turned down by the system from applying for something called the DACA Act in the United States, which allows undocumented immigrants who arrived when they were children to apply to not to be put on the back burner for deportation and be given working papers. But he was ineligible for this program because the database indicated that he was a gang member, and he's saying that was a false identification. It was based on information that they had about him. Obviously, there's nowhere, it wasn't a database that said gang member, not gang member. It had to do with patterns of his activity and his affiliations. So he's suing, and I don't know what the outcome of that will be, but it's somebody trying to hold an algorithm accountable. You wrongly identified me as a gang member. That affected my life chances in a significant way, so I'm going to take you to court on that. It'll be interesting to watch what happened. This is the details of the case. If the CPD had not labeled Mr. Pedrade a gang member and included him in its gang database, his application for DACA likely would have been granted and he would have received deferred action from deportation. That's the DACA Act. Mr. Pedrade's liberty has been deprived based on false evidence used against him that he could not challenge. That statement is a statement of the type of thing, type of concern that algorithmic decision making raises, right? Being deprived of some chance based on inaccuracy that can't be challenged, right? Those are the dimensions of accountability that we're concerned with. I spent some time in my career thinking about data mining and data collection and all the information that's collected about us by our various online devices and our interactions with networked spaces and things. I just saw this one, by the way. Did anybody see this? I saw this on Twitter tonight about the Roomba vacuum. Did anybody see that? What a great little story. It turns out that your Roomba is actually mapping your little robot vacuum cleaner is mapping your apartment, and they want to sell that information about people's apartments. This is a database that they've managed to collect, or this is information that the interactive device collects. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about all of the ways in which devices collect information about us and applications and so on. And often the rejoinder that I got when I was doing this a while ago was that, oh yeah, but that's just so they can market to us. And don't we want to be marketed to in customized ways? Isn't it better than having ads for stuff that we don't want? I don't know what that means for Roomba, like ads for whatever, certain size living room. Yeah. Oh yeah, probably nobody here. My students were saying this, but also I'd get this at conference presentations. But think, times have changed, right? Like I'm talking now like 10 years ago or something when or maybe not even that long ago, 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah.
They haven't changed.
More recently.
I went on the radio very recently here to talk about this exact thing, and it was a callback sort of show. So after I left the radio, they took calls, and the very first caller said, "I love it when Facebook tells me about something I really want. You know, like, that's perfect for me."
It's still there. And the case that I've been trying to make for a while is it's not like advertising. I'll have that discussion with you if you want, but not you guys, but whoever. but it's not just advertising, right? These are data-driven systems that are going to impact whole swaths of our lives. And you know, that moment is now really coming together in a way that I don't think it was quite so visible to people maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It seems to be more visible these days. This is from a piece that Will Knight did for the MIT publication. I can't remember which one, but I like the anguished character of it. Biased algorithms are everywhere and no one seems to care. I'm not sure if that's true that no one seems to care, but it feels a little bit akin to that moment of when information was being collected, detailed, comprehensive information was being collected about people and nobody seemed to care. Now that information is being put to use and quote unquote nobody seems to care. When will we begin to care? Well, you know, that's an open question and probably an empirical question, but you were going to say something, Dan? Oh no, sorry. That's my teacher impulse when the hand comes up. But I don't know if that's true, but I think we really need to start to care. And I'll, this is from one of Simon's articles. Your life is dominated. This is the first one they did, calling for information about how people are affected by algorithms. Your life is dominated by algorithms, and you know next to nothing about how they work or what consequences they have. And I think this is a key starting point for this claim of algorithmic accountability. We need to know more. And we also need to know the ways in which our lives are becoming dominated by these algorithms. So I'm going to give you a few recent concrete examples. I'm sorry if some of these might be familiar. I will say, does anybody know Cathy O'Neill's stuff? She wrote Weapons of Mass Destruction. It's about, she left academia to, this gets to the and nobody seems to care part, to open a consulting company that would evaluate algorithms for bias. And I read a quote from her not too long ago that said, "I have no customers." So, which gets to our question of who's going to do it, right? And if you're a private company waiting for somebody to pay you to do it, maybe that's not going to be the way to go. Some places to look. She wrote an article about how hiring algorithms work, and I just encountered this with my undergraduate students. You've probably encountered this before, but companies are increasingly using automated systems to screen resumes, and according to one research experiment that was done, about 72. It's possible for 72% of the resumes that are submitted to not be seen by a human. They get screened out by an algorithm. So then you have to figure out, how do you game the system? You know, and there are places where you can go to figure out what keywords for what types of jobs you're going to get you through the algorithm, what things you need to do in order to get through the algorithm. You know, I can't remember. I was reading some of it. It's like for I don't know, like special skills, you should have 5 but not 10. I don't know how they make these decisions. But the important point is that if you're applying for a job, you can get weeded out based on an automated system. How does it work? How is it deciding? What is it that's disqualifying you? And what happens when you're up against people who are learning ways to game that system? So that's one space to look at. College admissions. This was fascinating to me. A report by this is a kind of little liberal arts college in the U.S. And you know, I realize it's a different system from here. Although just returning to the Australian system, academic system, some of you who are academics may know this, the bureaucratic load in Australia is really impressive. the amount of paperwork and forms that you fill out the second you arrive and from there on in is on some quantum leap above anywhere else that I've encountered. I've worked at a variety of different institutions. And my first thought was, there's so many damn forms. This has to become automated, right? It's like too much information, and it already is becoming in a variety of ways. But once you create that much data and that much paperwork, the incentive to manage it in automated ways increases dramatically. So I'm anticipating this being, coming home to academics in very concrete ways. But this was interesting to me. They're not sending in they're not looking at the standardized test scores. They're looking at social media data, right? The same media that's being used for, by the Chicago Heat list, how many friends and photos they had on social media, for instance. There's a whole separate place to go there about what it means to game that type of a system and the type of pressure that puts on students to achieve in a very particular way. That was stunning to me. But anyway, I think one of the reasons they're doing it, bless you, is because it's a trove of data. Right? It's just more information than a simple score. And so they're thinking they've got more to work with. And if they're using database systems, it's nice to have more information. So for students in the US, they've developed systems that monitor students, particularly low-income students become the target of monitoring because they're considered at risk. In Australia, you have a quite distinctive term that goes along with this, which is used for all types of monitoring, duty of care, right? So I don't know if that's Australian, but I hadn't heard it until I came to Australia, duty of care. But anyway, the duty of care for low-income students is to monitor them more comprehensively in order to identify risk and intervene before students drop out. And so they monitor things, not just their coursework, they monitor their participation in social activities. They monitor their circulation around campus, how often they go to the library, when they're going to social spaces like dining halls. And they use this to calculate risk. And you probably saw this. In Australia, of course, this is the duty of care. Schools are tracking what students do on their mobile phones. And the point to be made about this type of information and about data mining in general is function creep or function migration, right? Once you start collecting data in order to hold students accountable in a bid to protect students from pornography, protection, predators, and other online dangers, you start to have a trove of data that then can be used for other purposes as well, right? Are they at risk of dropping out? Are they going to be, what school might they be suited to? So I'm going to switch a little bit and get to this question of bias. Biased algorithms are everywhere. This is from that MIT article. What does that mean, biased algorithms are everywhere? Well, here's some examples of work that people have done. Julia Angwin, probably many of you know her work. She works for ProPublica, and she's focused recently in doing reporting on bias in algorithmic systems. And one recent story that she did was around how insurance premium rates are set according to a formula that apparently incorporates historical forms of racial bias. So she compared neighborhoods that have the same risk of having accidents, in which the main salient difference was that one neighborhood was predominantly white and the other was predominantly African American, and the discrepancy in the insurance rates was dramatic. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was almost an order of magnitude in terms of what people were paying for insurance. Simon's work on this. It was really exciting to meet Simon and to see some of the work that he's doing, because I've been following, I have alerts that look at algorithmic accountability, and I've been seeing some of the work that he's looking at, the algorithms we know nothing about and why we need to know more. And he talked about algorithms that, for example, this is from his more recent work on which government agencies are using algorithms. You come back from overseas and made it through immigration without speaking to a human, and you're all experiencing that, right? Like it was interesting to me. I was coming in and out of Australia for a while. The humans are almost gone. The same thing happened to me when I came this time around. It was just the machine I went through, and I felt happy. The machine didn't find any problems. But obviously there's a back end that's processing all that information and deciding who gets flagged and stopped. And of course, the coverage recently of the automated Centrelink decisions that were sending out these notices about how much people owes, and kind of subtracting the human element from that, and the fallout from doing that in automated ways. I hope that I've done enough to convince you, or maybe you were already convinced, that these systems affect life chances in a variety of ways. The information environment is one of the other clear places to look for the impact of algorithmic systems on a democratic society. So you may have seen some of these studies. And I'm just thinking of all the ways in which our information is curated for us. The ads that we see, the news feeds that we get, the stories that appear, the searches that are returned in response to our queries that are customized to us. So this is a variety of different examples of bias. One research, oops, I don't think I have the, oh yeah. Google displayed adverts for career coaching service for 200 plus executive jobs, 1,000 times, almost 2,000 times to the male group, and only 318 times to the female group. So they had profiles that were male and female, and then they looked to see, they were doing job search requests, and they looked to see what if there was a discrepancy in the types of jobs that were served to them, and there was in this instance. This is a little example of something somebody did. I thought it was interesting. They just tried to see if Google Images accurately reflected the percentages of, in this case, female CEOs in the population. So they did Google searches of CEOs. I don't know how they controlled for who was doing the searches. It would be an interesting question there. But they came up with the fact that the images that you get when you enter a search actually reflect a reality that's different from the existing reality. You get 11% of women images in Google image searches of CEOs when they're actually 27% of the CEO population. This was a search that was done, I think it was at Harvard, found significant discrimination in advertising results depending on the perceived race of names. So she took an experiment that you may have heard about callbacks for job interviews that was done, I think it was in Chicago. They took people with historically black names associated associated with the African American population, and they saw who got a callback for resumes, and she took if they submitted CVs. She took that same database, and she found out that names that had historically black associations would yield advertisements that read "arrested," with a link to a website which could perform criminal record checks much more frequently than it happened to people who had names that were less clearly identified racially. This gets to Dan's work, stuff that Dan was talking to me about. This was some recent coverage, Will Knight again, of the databases that are used to train for machine learning for language, for machines that are processing language, trying to make sense out of language, interpret it, actually have built into the database gendered assumptions that presumably come from the training set, the bias that's in society, right? That gets embedded in the language and then gets embedded in the automated systems. So they found out that the data sets considered the word programmer closer to the word man than woman, and that the most similar word for woman is homemaker, right? And so the broader point here, right, is that biases in algorithms reflect and continue biases in society, right? So it's not that the algorithms are much worse than society. They take society and they build in the biases. But then the further question is, what does it mean to have them built into automated systems? What does that mean for their accessibility when you're thinking about how to counter bias? What does it mean for the accountability? What does it mean for the ability to identify and target bias? This was reporting that Julia Angwin did that showed that advertisers were able to discriminate on the basis of race who got to see housing ads. Now in the US, this is a no-no because race is a protected category when it comes to housing discrimination. So, but in effect, the advertisers were able to violate principle of non-discrimination. Facebook has since changed this after the reporting, but it shows how it's possible to use automated systems to engage in the forms of historical discrimination that have deeper histories. Another example of that is the big story that Julia Angwin did about the automated system that's used to decide, to make decisions about who gets paroled, and also sentencing based on the likelihood that people will be repeat offenders. And so there's an automated system that takes background information about offenders and then predicts how likely they are to reoffend. So it predicts recidivism rates. And what they found out that the scores were wrong 40% of the time across the board, and were biased against black defendants who were falsely labeled future criminals at almost twice the rate of white defendants, right? So when it made a mistake in the wrong way of saying, or whatever, I don't know if it's the wrong way, it made the mistake in the direction of saying they're likely to reoffend. It was twice as likely to do that, to get it wrong with black defendants. The question here is, of course, what's the baseline, right? Because you could make an argument, well, that's better than the system's been doing it so far. I don't know the answer to that, if that's better than how the system's been doing it so far. But it certainly raises that question of, if you're generating an algorithm that does that and gets it wrong systematically by race, what should be done to redress that? And she didn't have access to the algorithm here. They said it was proprietary, she couldn't inspect it. So what she had access to were the forms that they filled out and then the predictions that were made. And she had to do the process of sorting it out based on that. This is Amazon showing people, which search results they show based on who pays them. I'm going to skip over that because you've got enough examples now. Well, sorry, I've got it, so I might as well go. 3/4 of the time, Amazon placed its own products and those of companies that pay for its services in the recommended position, even when there were cheaper offers available from others. So that's your information environment. How are you going to know what products? It's like your own customized store that shows and features for you products that are more expensive than you could otherwise get. The key example here, of course, in the wake of Trump and Brexit, is the role that search algorithms play. You could say something like, I don't know, but this is probably too sweeping, but when I was coming up in being trained in media theory, we looked a lot at mass media and the ownership patterns of mass media to figure out how the message was being shaped by gatekeepers. And here, of course, what comes up is how the information that people are exposed to, not so much or the gatekeepers is different. There's a different space for gatekeeping, and it's the algorithms that decide what information gets shared and circulated, and also the algorithms that shape your information environment, right? So I tried this at home this morning, but if this is Google autofill, if you write climate change is, you get all of these. You don't get climate change is, the biggest environmental disaster that's facing us now. And again, these are artifacts. I don't think any of this stuff is deliberate, but they're artifacts of the way the systems work. And this is some research that was done about how partisanship is affected by algorithms. People who are very active politically are typically the most partisan. That means they're posting a lot. They're doing a lot of stuff online, so they generate links and connections, which means that extremist views peddled actively on blogs and fringe media sites get elevated in the search ranking. That's a quote from one of the researchers who was talking about this. This is not work that I've done myself, so I'm just putting that out there as findings, and we may contest some of those. Currently, the truth of a piece of content is less important than whether it is shared, liked, and monetized. So this question of how engagement metrics shift the landscape of how information is circulated is a key to understanding how it is that the information environments that we inhabited are shaped. Yeah, I was going to add something to that, but it's escaped me for a second. I think that some of the trends that are contributing to this formation of automation are the increasing, the tendency towards automation, which is fed by the huge amounts of data collection. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. We're living in a culture that has, I don't want to downplay, like I've sounded pretty critical and alarmist about it. I do want to concede that there are probably places where algorithmic decision making has huge advantages, conveniences, and also benefits in countering bias, right? So in places where there are historical forms of bias, it's conceivable that an algorithm that's constructed to contest them could come in and redress those forms of bias. But I don't think that that's necessarily going to happen on its own. The part that worries me is the way in which parts of our own culture become inaccessible or unavailable to us, right? Those biases that get built in and then get baked into systems that are harder to unearth or to access or to talk about unless we can somehow excavate or unbake the way they get built in. Yeah, that part you've heard, sorry. I think the things that we need to watch out for, again, there are benefits and concerns, but one is the growth of bureaucratic systems like the ones that I mentioned at the university that are fed by the proliferation of data collection. That's the model. And it's an economic model in many ways that we've pinned our digital media economy upon. But once we pin it on that model, the incentive to collect all of this information is huge. And then once you have all that information, the attempt to manage it automatically becomes irresistible. And data collection, this is the point I wanted to make about the news, goes hand in hand with increasing customization and specification. It's not just that more information allows more customized content to be provided to you, but it's that the specification of the device itself allows for increasingly detailed forms of information collection, right? As you think about news, I don't know, the journalists among you, think about the way in which how mass media worked. And I don't know how much nostalgia I have for mass media, but one of the ways that it worked was to produce what Cass Sunstein called general interest intermediaries, which were kind of media outlets, whether you're thinking about the evening news or the local newspaper, that's meant to serve a kind of broad audience, and therefore has a range of different types of articles. And customized or specified news, of course, is targeted to a particular individual reader's interests. This is what Nicholas Negroponte dubbed the Daily Me way back in the mid-90s. But the difference between a general interest intermediary, which is calculated to fit the big middle, right? And a specified one which is targeted and built around particular preferences. And what it means to exist in one media ecosystem versus another, I think gets to the issues of that I talked about earlier, about how our information environment is shaped and these forms of polarization that people are concerned about. So anyway, I've talked a lot, and there's pizza, so I'm going to take this as a natural pizza break. But if you so let's have some food. But what I'd really be interested in talking about is some of these principles of algorithmic accountability, but also strategies. And where I'm going with this, just to right before the break, is I'm vested in this because it's kind of a project that I'm really interested in, but I think the combination of public service media and the academic sector is going to be the place that we're going to need to turn to do this type of accountability work, right? I don't think the private sector is going to do it. I don't think big bureaucratic government systems are going to be interested in doing it. So that's the plea. That's why I'm really glad to be able to speak to everybody here, because down the road, I hope or envision the possibility of collaborations that bring public service media together with academics who have expertise in some of these cultural and political issues, but also domain-specific issues, education, healthcare, policing, and also the technical issues. I'm hoping that there will emerge a formation that starts to be able to act as an institution or a team or a system that can engage in these accountability issues. Thanks so much for that. Let's break. And then probably the best thing to do is just have a conversation afterwards about some of these issues. Yeah. Thanks so much.